Welcome back to Final Trade. I wanted to talk today about what is the vintage era of Magic the Gathering that I'm always mentioning here. First off, we're not talking about the vintage tournament format in Magic. What we're talking about is a subjective term, there's no hard definition on it. And to me, it's mostly defined by the frame on the cards. The old, bigger frame that ran from Alpha through Scourge and 7th edition. And to a lesser extent, it's the art style. So it's more traditional media, drawings, paintings, things like that, with less digital help, you could say. And so, if you look at modern cards today, it's you can tell there's a lot more digital assistance in the artwork. After Scourge, which was the third set of the Onslaught block, and after 7th edition, Wizards of the Coast moved to a thinner frame around the card so that they could make the picture bigger, they could make the text box bigger, but they also did some other changes, like kind of changing this color. I mean, this is a white card and here's a black card. They kind of changed how these colors are presented. They messed with the mana symbols, and they did a lot of tuning to the rules of the game, which I'll go into in other videos. But the vintage era of Magic to me is anything with this old style, this old frame, the older art. Even though later in the vintage era, you do see a transition to more digital assistance in creating the artwork. So you see some of these cards, it's just you can tell these were, I don't want to say crude, but they were drawings or paintings, and just a much more real style maybe. Again, less digital assistance, and it really shows. You can just really see the difference compared to modern cards, and I'll show some more modern stuff in a bit to kind of give you that comparison. So there's that. Also, there's just a lot less flashiness. The first foil cards in Magic the Gathering's history were released in Urza's Legacy, and they were actually they were much less common than foil cards now are. And I've got a couple here. I don't know how well this is going to come through. It's really hard to kind of get a shine off of these and get the reflection on camera when I've got a bunch of lights set up for filming. But, when these were released in Urza's Saga, they would just randomly replace one card of any rarity within a pack. And so you were not guaranteed a foil in every booster pack. There were no 2 foil packs, 3 foil packs, 4 foil packs. There were no collector's packs that had 9 or 10 foils in them. It was just once in a while you might get one of these foiled cards. And this was kind of the first foray into foiling cards and trying to make them more flashy. But again, this didn't happen until at least 2/3 of the way through the vintage era. So, if you put on a timeline Alpha through the Onslaught block, this is 2/3 of the way across that timeline before they got into even this low level of flashiness. Another thing is they only had very limited use of alternate art cards. So here are some from Alliances: Storm Shaman, 2 different artworks, Guerrilla Tactics with 2 different artworks. And I'm not exactly sure on the history of these, why some of these exist, because I'm not sure that they had any of this alternate art type of stuff in Ice Age, but in Alliances they did. And so there was kind of a transition in the art style between Homelands and Alliances and then on into the Mirage block. And I kind of wonder if they were just using up artworks they had commissioned. For instance, here's Order of Leaper with 3 different artworks. Famously, Hymn to Turok has 4 different artworks. So, but this stopped at homelands and alliances. There was no more of this in Mirage Block or later until much further outside of the vintage era of Magic, when Wizards of the Coast started putting a lot of alternate art stuff in. So something else you notice is there's no full art. There's no there's none of any of the fancier variations of cards. They just didn't exist back then. And so here's a good example of kind of the old style, drawn and painted and then photographed and used for the cards. Here's a Disrupting Scepter. They used this picture up to 4th edition. I don't think they printed this card in 5th. This is a 4th edition copy. But then here's 6th edition. And so you can see that, it's still kind of started as possibly a hand-drawn or painted picture, and then it had a lot of digital assistance. And then you can see when we get into 7th edition, there's a lot more digital assistance. And, in a nutshell, that's kind of how the progression was going in the art. So, and into the mid and late era of vintage Magic, you can see much further into the transition. Here's 3 cards from Tempest, and you can tell they've had a lot more digital editing done to them, but they probably all started out being worked on by hand. So that's kind of the point in the art styles and how it evolved over time. But there's some other issues that go into defining the vintage era of Magic. One is that it's 31 sets of cards that were released over a 10-year period, and that's just counting the core and expansion sets and counting Chronicles, which was a compilation set. And there were a few other products that were released in that time. There was like the Beat Down Battle Deck thing, and there was anthologies, and a couple other of these compilation products that were pre-built. But the bulk of it was the 31 core and expansion sets in the 10-year period. And if we look at the last 10 years, going from now in 2021 backwards, and you say, how many sets has Wizards of the Coast released for Magic in the previous 10 years from today backwards, it's 40 core and expansion sets. And on top of that, they've released 11 dual decks, 5 from the Vault products. Almost all of the Commander products have been in the last 10 years, and almost all of the Masters products have been in the last 10 years. And so they've kind of gone to this breakneck pace of releasing products, and there's consequences to that. There's a lack of play testing that people complain about, and so that ends up resulting in a lot of card banning coming later down the line when the players figure out the problems with certain overpowered combos or merely single overpowered cards. And so, you kind of see those consequences, and it's a little frustrating because you feel like WotC is just kind of running at a breakneck pace to push product out into the market. And, the other consequence of that is that you have player fatigue. You have huge turnover in the pool of Magic players because they don't like being pressured to buy so much stuff so often. And so a lot of people just can't afford to keep up, and they end up quitting. And I think that's really unfortunate. But, if you just focus on the era of vintage Magic cards, well, there's no new ones being made. Arguably, Time Spiral Remastered and The List, if you know what that is. So those are kind of modern printings of old cards with these old frames. But, for the great most part, none of this is being created today. And so there's not that pressure to keep up with an ever-expanding landscape of cards. And so I guess we'll get to one of the questions is why do we like vintage Magic? And for me, chiefly it's nostalgia. I played this in high school, and then I quit, and I was gone for about 20 years, and then I've come back recently. And it's amazing to hold these cards again, to touch them, to see them, to hear the way they sound when you're flipping through them in your hand. And, It's like there's a certain purity in the game when you play with these old cards that the new cards don't have, because there's just so much flashiness in the cards today, and it feels like WotC has kind of lost its way, and I hate talking like that because it sounds really pretentious, and you really have to back it up with evidence, but it feels like being owned by Hasbro now, Hasbro makes Wizards of the Coast make decisions that are bad for the long-term future of Magic. Also, there's problems in trading card games with power creep. And so as Magic closes in on being a 30-year-old game, the power creep is just expanded and expanded and expanded. And it's harder to contain, and of course there are issues where a new trading card game will come out, and the developers might release a lot of way overpowered stuff early on, which we certainly saw in Magic with Power 9 and Vesuvan Doppelganger and Wheel of Fortune and Demonic Tutor and great old cards like that. They're just wildly overpowered. But as you go forward and forward in time, the developers have to keep increasing the power of the cards. Otherwise, people won't buy them to put into their decks. They won't see a point. There's also been a lot said in the last number of years about quality problems of products coming out of WotC, warped foil cards. I mean, you can go on YouTube and you can find videos of people showing how to fix your warped foil cards by sitting them on a space heater for a few minutes, and it'll get it to lay flat again, and a couple weeks later you do it again because it warps up. So it's crazy, and that goes back to the breakneck pace of the work. It's like quality's gone out the window in order to get product out the door. In a lot of ways, it's like the stories of artists who become famous. You'll have an artist who creates something, and it's renowned for how pure it is, and the kind of emotion that they tapped into to create it, and then they become famous for that, and eventually the fame and the recognition helps them to create more art, and they kind of exorcise their demons that were causing them to make this great art, and then they just kind of make bland junk. Famously, about 10 years ago, a guy wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it was just an amazing book when it came out, and everyone I talked to ever who read it was just floored by how insightful the book was. And then he wrote a second book called Collapse, and basically they gave him free rein to write whatever he wanted because he was such a genius with the first book, and the second book was just garbage. And it's like that's happened to WotC over the last nearly 3 decades now. I think for all those reasons, these coming 5 years or so, the TCG marketplace is WotC's to lose, and as market share, and I think they're setting themselves up for failure. Not like they're going to go out of business, not like Magic is going to end, but I think they're going to definitely lose market share over the next 5 years because of the decisions they're making today and that they've been making for the previous 5 years. So, coming back to the main topic, what are we doing here at Final Trade? First, I just want to give people an appreciation for vintage Magic cards, for the kind of cards that were available nearly 30 years ago, the kind of decks that were being played at the time, and then, generally game theory and economic theory applied to games, things like that could go in with any game. I mean, if you play Monopoly, it helps you if you understand game theory. But, I'm going to mix that in with this channel that's tries to be mostly focused on vintage era of Magic. So, if you like this old kind of stuff, like this classic Sly deck from the late 90s, I've got other decks coming: Rack Balance, Counter Phoenix, Turbostasis, Pros Bloom, Necropotent, some others. Tell me down below what decks you want to see from the era. We'll put them together and we'll play them. And if you like this kind of stuff, if this is exciting to you, subscribe to the channel and come along. It's going to be great. And remember, no cards under 18 allowed.